The cruelest revenge is not losing your fortune. It is watching the person you discarded become the only one who can save you. The rain had just begun when Claire Bennett stepped out of the courthouse carrying a single Navy suitcase that looked almost weightless compared to the life she had just left behind. The marble steps shimmered beneath gray skies while camera flashes burst across the afternoon like tiny explosions of judgment. Reporters crowded behind the barricades, shouting questions she never answered. They called Ethan Crawford America's youngest billionaire. They called his company unstoppable. They called their divorce the end of a fairy tale. No one asked what happened to the woman who had quietly disappeared from every headline the moment the ink dried on the papers. Claire paused only once, pulling the collar of her coat closer against the cold October wind. Behind her, the massive courthouse doors opened again. Ethan emerged surrounded by attorneys, executives, and security. His tailored charcoal suit looked untouched by the weather, his polished shoes reflecting the city lights beginning to wake across Manhattan. He didn't look toward Claire immediately. He was too busy shaking hands with investors who congratulated him on protecting his fortune. When his eyes finally found hers across the crowded steps, there was no anger, no sadness, only certainty. The certainty of a man convinced he had already won. He crossed the distance with calm confidence, stopping just close enough for only she could hear him above the rain. "You'll never survive without me." His voice was smooth, almost gentle, the kind of tone that hurt more because it carried no emotion. Claire looked at him for a long second. 3 years of marriage flashed silently through her mind. Long nights inside conference rooms where she organized impossible schedules while he charmed investors. Countless dinners abandoned because another business emergency demanded attention. Dreams she quietly folded away so his could become reality. She could have reminded him of every sacrifice. She could have argued that success had never belonged to one person alone. Instead, she simply nodded. Once, picked up her suitcase, and walked away without another word. Behind her, applause erupted as Ethan greeted another television crew. The cameras followed him. They never noticed the woman disappearing into the crowd. 3 years later, those same cameras were waiting outside Crawford Global headquarters. Only this time, no one was celebrating. Satellite trucks lined the avenue. Stock prices had collapsed before the opening bell. Employees stood in anxious clusters staring at their phones. Financial reporters spoke in urgent whispers about debt, investigations, and desperate negotiations. Inside the top-floor executive office, Ethan stood alone before a wall of glass overlooking the city that had once admired him. His reflection looked older than the calendar suggested. The confidence that had once filled every room now fractured beneath sleepless eyes and tightened shoulders. A senior board member entered carrying a thin black folder. No greetings. No small talk. Only one sentence. "We've contacted everyone." Ethan turned slowly, and the board member hesitated before sliding a single business card across the polished conference table. One name. Claire Bennett. Ethan stared at the card as though it belonged to someone else. The room became impossibly quiet. Outside, Manhattan continued moving beneath gray skies, unaware that the woman who had once walked away carrying nothing now held the only key to saving the empire that had abandoned her. Claire Bennett did not disappear because she was weak. She disappeared because the world had stopped looking. The morning after the divorce, she rented a studio apartment above a neighborhood bakery on the Upper West Side. Every morning before sunrise, the smell of fresh bread drifted through the old windows, mixing with the sound of delivery trucks and the steady rhythm of a city that never waited for broken hearts. Her closet held only a handful of coats. Her kitchen table doubled as a desk. The expensive jewelry she had once worn at charity galas was gone, replaced by a simple silver watch that reminded her every hour could become a new beginning if she chose not to waste it. Friends she had known through Ethan quietly disappeared from her phone. Invitations stopped arriving. Holiday cards never came. It was astonishing how quickly people forgot someone whose name had never appeared on the company letterhead, even if that person had quietly solved problems no one else could. Claire never corrected the stories circulating through New York's business circles. Some believed she had taken a generous settlement and retired. Others assumed she had married into another wealthy family. The truth was far less glamorous. She worked. Every single day, she accepted consulting projects that larger firms considered too small to notice. Family-owned manufacturers struggling with cash flow. Regional distributors losing long-standing customers. Independent retailers buried beneath poor management decisions. She listened before speaking. She asked questions others overlooked. She searched for patterns hidden beneath spreadsheets instead of chasing quick headlines. Clients rarely remembered the elegant woman who had once stood beside one of the country's most celebrated billionaires. They remembered something else instead. Results. One company stabilized after 6 months. Another doubled its revenue within a year. A third avoided bankruptcy because Claire noticed a flaw in a contract that everyone else had ignored. She never celebrated publicly. She simply packed her notebook, thanked her clients, and moved on to the next challenge. At night, she studied industries she had never worked in before, filling shelves with thick reports and handwritten notes. Every lesson became another brick in the quiet life she was building. There were lonely evenings, of course. Sometimes she would pause while making dinner for one person and remember the enormous dining room where silence had once echoed louder than conversation. Sometimes she would catch herself reaching for a second coffee mug before realizing there was no one else to pour for. Those moments came and went like passing storms. She never allowed them to become permanent weather. Across the city, Ethan Crawford continued appearing on magazine covers beside headlines celebrating expansion, record valuations, and ambitious acquisitions. Television anchors praised his instincts. Investors admired his confidence. Yet inside Crawford Global, decisions were being made faster than questions could be asked. Experienced executives quietly resigned. Departments stopped communicating with one another. Risk reports were shortened because no one wanted to interrupt another celebration. The company kept growing, but its foundation was beginning to crack in places invisible to the public. Claire never followed the financial news closely. She had promised herself that her future would never again depend upon Ethan's success or failure. Still, one rainy evening, while reviewing documents for a manufacturing client, her laptop displayed a breaking market alert. Crawford Global shares had suffered their sharpest single-day decline in company history. She stared at the headline for only a few seconds before closing it without opening the article. Then she returned to the balance sheet waiting on her desk, unaware that somewhere across Manhattan, people who had never spoken her name before were about to begin searching for it. The city moved at its usual relentless pace, but inside the boardroom of Crawford Global, time seemed to hesitate. The polished walnut table that had once hosted celebrations of record-breaking profits was now covered with reports highlighted in red, each page telling the same unforgiving story. Revenue had slowed. Debt payments were approaching. Investors who had once competed for Ethan Crawford's attention were suddenly requesting emergency meetings instead. No one raised their voice. The silence was far more unsettling than panic. Ethan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows with his hands folded behind his back, watching streams of yellow taxis weave through the streets below. 3 years ago, he believed success was permanent. He believed confidence alone could carry an empire forward. Now every sunrise seemed to deliver another problem that could not be solved with another acquisition or another inspiring speech. His chief financial officer carefully placed a thick folder in front of him. "We have exhausted every internal option," she said quietly. Ethan turned another page, then another, searching for numbers that refused to improve. Every proposed solution required time the company no longer had. Every strategy depended upon trust that had already begun to disappear from the market. Across the room, board members exchanged cautious glances. They had spent months pretending the cracks were temporary. Now those cracks had become impossible to ignore. Finally, the chairman leaned forward. "There is one recommendation that continues to appear from every independent advisor we have consulted." Ethan looked up without speaking. The chairman slid a document across the table. Instead of another financial forecast, it contained a list of successful corporate recoveries completed over the past 3 years. Different industries, different states, different challenges. Yet one name appeared beside every remarkable turnaround. Claire Bennett. Ethan frowned. The name settled heavily into the room before memory caught up with recognition. It could not be the same Claire. The woman he remembered had never wanted attention. She preferred solving problems behind closed doors while others accepted applause. He opened the report anyway. Company after company described the same pattern. She entered quietly. She listened longer than she spoke. She rebuilt trust before rebuilding profits. Within months, organizations that had stood on the edge of collapse found stability again. One executive had written a simple sentence in a testimonial. "She does not rescue companies. She teaches them how to stop destroying themselves." Ethan read the line twice. Something unfamiliar settled into his expression. Doubt. Not about Claire's ability, but about his own memory. Had he truly understood the woman he married? Or had he only noticed the victories while ignoring the hands that helped create them? That evening, while board members continued debating financing options, Claire was nearly 100 miles away in a small manufacturing town outside Philadelphia. She wore a navy blazer, carried the same worn leather notebook she had used for years, and walked through a family-owned factory where machines hummed steadily beneath bright fluorescent lights. She greeted employees by name after only one visit, stopping to ask a supervisor about his daughter's college applications and complimenting another worker on a production improvement she had suggested the previous month. The owner watched with quiet amazement. "You remember everyone," he said. Claire smiled gently. "Businesses do not fail because of numbers alone. They fail when people stop feeling seen." As she finished the final walkthrough, her phone vibrated inside her coat pocket. An unknown Manhattan number appeared on the screen. She glanced at it for a moment before letting the call ring into silence. She had another meeting to finish, another client to help, and no reason to believe that the life she had left behind was finally beginning to search for her. Claire ignored the missed call because the people who truly needed her always left a message explaining the problem instead of expecting her to rescue them without context. By the time she returned to her hotel that evening, another unknown number had appeared on her screen, followed by a brief voicemail from an executive search firm requesting an urgent conversation regarding a confidential corporate crisis. She listened without reacting, placed her phone on the nightstand, and opened her notebook instead. Tomorrow's schedule was already full. A family-owned logistics company in Pittsburgh needed help rebuilding supplier relationships after years of poor leadership decisions. Those people had trusted her first. They deserved her complete attention. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, another difficult morning settled over Crawford Global. The lobby that had once echoed with confident conversations now felt strangely restrained. Employees spoke in lower voices. Financial news played continuously across television screens mounted beside the reception desk. Every hour seemed to bring another analyst lowering the company's outlook. Investors no longer debated how high the stock might climb. They debated whether the company could protect what remained. Ethan arrived before sunrise, carrying a cup of black coffee that grew cold before he remembered to drink it. He spent the first hour reviewing proposals from prestigious consulting firms. Every presentation promised aggressive restructuring, immediate cost reductions, and complicated financial engineering. None of them addressed the one problem Ethan could no longer ignore. Crawford Global had stopped understanding its own people. Departments blamed one another instead of solving problems. Managers feared delivering bad news. Talented employees quietly accepted positions elsewhere, while executives insisted everything remained under control. The numbers reflected a deeper truth that spreadsheets alone could not repair. During another emergency board meeting, an independent director cleared his throat before speaking carefully. "We have interviewed 6 turnaround firms. They all recommended the same person before recommending themselves." Ethan did not need to ask the name this time. He already knew. Another folder appeared in front of him containing articles, interviews, and client testimonials that Claire had never promoted herself. She had never sought magazine covers or television appearances. Instead, respected business journals described her as the consultant who rebuilt trust before rebuilding balance sheets. One article included a photograph of Claire standing inside a small manufacturing facility, wearing simple business clothes, smiling beside factory employees rather than executives. There was nothing glamorous about the image. Yet Ethan found himself staring at it longer than any award he had ever received. He remembered evenings years earlier when Claire would quietly ask questions about employee retention or customer loyalty while he focused on expansion and market valuation. At the time, he believed she worried too much about details. Now he wondered whether those details had been the foundation he had mistaken for decoration. Later that afternoon, the chairman entered Ethan's office carrying no reports, only a single envelope. "She finally returned our call," he said. Ethan looked up immediately. Did she agree? The chairman shook his head gently. She declined the meeting because she was honoring commitments to existing clients. She said every business that trusted her deserved the same respect, regardless of its size. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the city stretching beyond the glass. For the first time in years, he understood that influence was not measured by the height of an office or the value of a company. It was measured by the promises a person refused to break. As evening settled over Manhattan, Claire finished her presentation inside a modest conference room hundreds of miles away. The grateful owner thanked her for saving jobs that had been in his family for 3 generations. Claire simply smiled, packed her notebook, and walked into the cool evening air. She still did not know that every hour she spent helping ordinary businesses made the largest company she had ever left even more desperate to find her. The invitation arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, printed on thick ivory paper with nothing except a date, a time, and the address of a private conference room overlooking Central Park. There was no company logo, no executive title, only a handwritten note at the bottom. "We hope you will give us 1 hour." Claire Bennett placed the envelope beside her coffee without opening her calendar. She already knew who had sent it. News about Crawford Global had become impossible to avoid. Every financial network analyzed the company's decline. Every business journal speculated about emergency refinancing, leadership changes, and restless investors. Yet none of those headlines interested Claire as much as the handwritten sentence. Someone inside that company had finally understood that respect could not be expressed through contracts alone. She finished reviewing the proposal on her desk before calling her assistant. "Can we move Friday's client meeting to Monday?" she asked calmly. "Only if they agree." Less than 30 minutes later, the answer came back. The client had insisted she should accept the New York meeting first. "If the stories are true," the owner laughed over the phone, "they need you more than we do." Claire thanked him quietly, but the words stayed with her long after the call ended. She had spent 3 years becoming someone whose reputation traveled farther than she ever tried to. Not because she chased recognition, but because grateful clients spoke honestly about the work she had done. 2 days later, the train carried her toward Manhattan beneath a pale autumn sky. She chose the window seat, opened a leather notebook, and reviewed notes instead of reading the latest articles about Crawford Global. She had learned long ago that newspapers described symptoms. Real answers waited inside conversations with people. As the skyline slowly appeared across the horizon, memories drifted back without permission. She remembered arriving in the city years earlier with Ethan, believing they were building a future together instead of building a company that would eventually leave only one name standing in the spotlight. The memories no longer carried bitterness. They simply belonged to another version of herself. At Crawford Global, preparations for the meeting transformed the entire executive floor. The conference room overlooking the park had been stripped of unnecessary decorations. No photographers were invited. No press releases had been prepared. Even the chairman insisted that only essential executives would attend. "If she walks through that door," he warned, "she is not here because she needs us. We are here because we need her." Ethan listened without arguing. He had spent the previous evening reading every report written about Claire's consulting work. None of them praised dramatic speeches or bold promises. Instead, they described patience, discipline, and an unusual ability to rebuild confidence inside organizations that had forgotten how to trust themselves. Those qualities sounded strangely familiar. He realized they had been present throughout their marriage, hidden beneath moments he had dismissed as ordinary. By late afternoon, Ethan stood alone inside the conference room while sunlight reflected softly across the polished table. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, as confident and restless as ever. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. His assistant stepped inside. "She has arrived." Ethan felt his heartbeat slow instead of quicken. Success had introduced him to presidents, celebrities, and global investors without ever making him nervous. Yet standing only a few steps away from the woman he believed he had left behind felt different. Outside the conference room, Claire handed her coat to the receptionist with an effortless smile, thanked the young assistant who greeted her, and waited patiently as the heavy walnut doors began to open. Neither of them knew exactly what would be said first, but both understood that the next few moments would weigh far more than the 3 years that had separated them. The conference room doors opened without ceremony, and for a brief moment the city itself seemed to fade into silence. Claire Bennett stepped inside with the same calm expression she had worn while visiting small factories and family businesses across the country. She carried no assistant, no stack of presentations, and no attempt to impress anyone. A slim leather notebook rested beneath her arm, and the quiet confidence in her posture made the enormous room feel strangely smaller. Ethan Crawford looked up from the conference table and forgot the sentence he had prepared. 3 years had changed everything he expected and nothing he remembered. Claire had not returned dressed in extravagance or surrounded by publicity. She looked composed, grounded, and completely comfortable standing in the room where she had once been overlooked. She offered a polite smile to the chairman before acknowledging Ethan with a simple nod. "Good afternoon." Her voice was steady, neither warm nor cold. It carried the confidence of someone who no longer needed anyone else's approval. The chairman invited her to take a seat. As she settled into the chair across from Ethan, several executives exchanged curious glances. They had expected tension, perhaps resentment, or carefully hidden anger. Instead, Claire opened her notebook, uncapped a pen, and waited patiently for someone to explain why they had asked for her time. Ethan finally spoke. "Thank you for coming." Claire looked at him with quiet professionalism. "Your letter mentioned an urgent business matter." There was no reference to their marriage, no mention of the courthouse, no reminder of the day they had last stood face to face. The years between them had been folded away, replaced by the simple expectations of a professional meeting. The chairman cleared his throat before sliding several reports across the table. "Our company is facing challenges that have grown beyond our internal ability to resolve. We would like you to evaluate the situation and tell us whether recovery is still possible." Claire did not reach for the documents immediately. Instead, she studied the people sitting around the table. Some looked exhausted. Others appeared defensive. A few avoided eye contact altogether. She had seen this pattern before. Every struggling organization eventually reached a point where fear became louder than cooperation. She opened the first report, scanning several pages without interruption. The room remained completely silent except for the soft turning of paper. After several minutes, she closed the folder and folded her hands together. "These reports explain what happened to your finances," she said calmly. "They do not explain what happened to your culture." The sentence landed more heavily than anyone expected. One executive shifted uncomfortably. Another quietly lowered his eyes. Ethan remained still, waiting for her to continue. "Numbers are never the beginning of a crisis," Claire said. "They are the final symptom. Companies begin failing much earlier, when people stop telling the truth because they believe no one wants to hear it." No one interrupted her. The chairman slowly nodded, recognizing the honesty that months of expensive consulting reports had failed to provide. Ethan found himself remembering conversations from years ago when Claire had questioned rapid expansion without stronger communication between departments. At the time, he had dismissed those concerns as unnecessary caution. Sitting across from her now, he realized she had been seeing problems long before anyone else noticed them. Claire closed her notebook and looked directly at Ethan for the first time since entering the room. There was no accusation in her eyes, only clarity. "Before I consider any proposal," she said, "I need complete access to your leadership team, your operational data, and your employees. I do not solve problems by protecting egos. I solve them by finding the truth." Ethan held her gaze for several quiet seconds before answering with complete sincerity. "You will have whatever you need." For the first time since the company began falling apart, hope did not arrive through another ambitious plan or another confident promise. It arrived in the form of a woman who no longer needed to prove her worth because her work had already done it for her. The meeting ended without applause, yet no one stood immediately. Claire's final words lingered in the room long after she closed her notebook. One by one, the executives quietly gathered their folders and stepped into the hallway, speaking in hushed voices that carried a mixture of uncertainty and cautious optimism. Within minutes, only Ethan and Claire remained inside the conference room. The afternoon sunlight had softened into a warm golden glow that stretched across the polished table where they had once celebrated ambitious expansion plans years before. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It simply acknowledged everything that words could not easily explain. Ethan slowly walked toward the window overlooking Central Park, watching people cross the winding paths below. each carrying lives that continued regardless of stock prices or board meetings. Without turning around, he finally broke the silence. I spent 3 years believing I lost my company because the market changed. He paused before continuing in a quieter voice. Now I think I lost it because I stopped listening to the people who were trying to protect it. Claire remained seated, her hands resting calmly on the closed notebook. Companies rarely collapse in a single day, she replied. They drift there one decision at a time. Ethan nodded almost instinctively. He understood those words better than he wished he did. For years he had measured success through acquisitions, quarterly reports, and media attention, while quietly overlooking the conversations that never reached the executive floor. He turned to face her, and for the first time since the divorce there was no confidence left to hide behind, only honesty. I owe you an apology. Claire met his eyes with the same composed expression she had carried into the room. She did not interrupt him. She did not encourage him either. Ethan continued carefully, choosing each word as though it carried real weight. I convinced myself that everything we built belonged to me because my name was on the building. I accepted recognition that should have been shared. I dismissed ideas because they came from someone I thought would always stay beside me. His voice grew quieter. I was wrong. Claire listened without visible emotion. The apology did not erase the past, nor did it reopen old wounds. It simply existed as a truth that had finally arrived, years later than it should have. After a long moment, she stood and walked toward the window until they were both looking at the same city from opposite sides of the glass. An apology has value, she said gently, but it cannot become a strategy. Ethan lowered his eyes. Then tell me what I should do. Claire answered without hesitation. If you want to save this company, stop asking how to protect your reputation. Start asking how to protect the people who trusted it with their careers. Every employee walking through your lobby this morning was wondering whether they still have a future here. They deserve leadership, not reassurance. Ethan remained silent. Those words reached deeper than any financial analysis ever had. Finally, he faced her completely, no longer speaking as the billionaire whose confidence once filled every room. He spoke as a man who understood that pride had become an obstacle instead of a strength. Claire, he said quietly, I am not asking you as my former wife. I am asking you as the only person I believe can save this company. Please help us. The room became perfectly still. Claire studied his face for several seconds, searching not for regret alone, but for sincerity. Then she gave the smallest nod. If I accept this responsibility, she said calmly, I will make decisions based on what is right for the company, not what is comfortable for its leadership. That includes you. Ethan answered immediately. I understand. For the first time in years, the balance between them had completely changed. Not because Claire sought revenge, and not because Ethan had surrendered his title, but because respect had quietly replaced the power that arrogance could never hold forever. Claire accepted the assignment the following morning, but her first decision surprised everyone on the executive floor. She refused the corner office prepared for her and instead requested a modest conference room beside the operations department. If I am going to understand this company, she explained, I need to hear the conversations that happened before problems become reports. By the end of the first week, she had met warehouse supervisors in New Jersey, customer service representatives in Ohio, software engineers in Texas, and regional managers across the country through long video conferences that rarely appeared on any executive calendar. She asked the same question every time. If you could change one thing without asking permission, what would it be? At first, employees answered cautiously. Years of being ignored had taught them to protect themselves with careful words. But Claire listened without interrupting. She wrote every concern by hand. She remembered names, departments, and small details about families and careers. Gradually, people began speaking with honesty instead of fear. Patterns emerged that no financial statement had revealed. Departments competed instead of cooperating. Managers delayed difficult conversations because they feared disappointing senior leadership. Talented employees left quietly after realizing that ideas mattered less than titles. Claire filled an entire wall with handwritten notes connected by thin blue lines. When Ethan entered the room one evening, he expected charts filled with numbers. Instead, he found a map of conversations, decisions, and relationships. This, Claire said, resting her hand gently against the wall, is where your company has been breaking apart. Ethan studied the notes in silence. Several observations sounded strangely familiar. Then he noticed something written beside an old expansion project completed years earlier. His eyes narrowed. "I remember this strategy," he said softly. "It was presented during our annual leadership summit." Claire nodded. "Do you remember who designed it?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "My executive team." Claire quietly opened an archive folder that had been stored in the company's records department for years. Inside were meeting notes, early drafts, handwritten revisions, and planning documents dated before the public presentation. Nearly every page carried the same initials in the corner. CB. Ethan slowly turned each page. The original market entry strategy. The employee retention model. The supplier partnership framework that had once doubled company growth. Document after document revealed the same pattern. Claire had developed many of the company's defining ideas long before they reached the boardroom. Others had polished the presentations. Ethan had delivered the speeches. Recognition had followed his name alone. The chairman entered quietly and looked through the files with growing surprise. "These were never included in the official records," he murmured. Claire simply smiled. "I never asked for credit. At the time, I believed success shared inside a marriage did not need two signatures." The room fell silent. No accusation filled her voice. There was only quiet truth. Ethan closed the final folder with careful hands. Memories returned that he had never questioned before. Countless late nights when Claire remained awake reviewing proposals while he prepared for investor meetings. Conversations where she challenged assumptions he later repeated as his own. He realized she had never stood behind his success. She had stood beneath part of its foundation. During the next board meeting, the chairman looked around the table before speaking with unusual clarity. "We cannot rebuild this company by pretending its history began with one person." Several directors nodded in agreement. No one argued. Respect had entered the room without demanding attention. As Claire gathered her notebook at the end of the meeting, she looked once across the table at Ethan. There was no triumph in her expression because proving someone wrong had never been her destination. She had come to restore a company that thousands of ordinary people depended upon, and in doing so, she had quietly restored a truth that had waited years to be seen. Spring arrived quietly in Manhattan, and with it came the first quarter in nearly a year that Crawford Global reported growth instead of decline. Financial news anchors called it one of the most remarkable corporate recoveries in recent memory. Analysts praised disciplined leadership, renewed employee confidence, and a culture that had transformed from fear into accountability. Yet inside the headquarters, the people who had lived through the darkest months knew the truth. The turnaround had not begun with a financial model. It had begun the day someone finally chose to listen. Claire Bennett walked through the lobby one last time as employees smiled and greeted her by name. The security guard who had welcomed her on the first morning thanked her for always remembering his daughter's graduation. A young analyst stopped to express gratitude because her suggestion had encouraged junior employees to speak openly during meetings. A warehouse supervisor visiting from Ohio shook her hand with genuine emotion. "You reminded us that we mattered," he said. Claire simply smiled. "You always did." Upstairs, the board of directors gathered for one final session before officially closing the restructuring project. The chairman stood and addressed the room with unusual warmth. "There are moments in a company's history that define its future. This will be remembered as one of them." He turned toward Claire. "Your work saved more than a balance sheet. You restored our character." The room responded with quiet applause, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect had finally found the person who had earned it years before. After the meeting concluded, Ethan waited outside the boardroom while the others departed. The hallway overlooking the city was calm, filled with soft afternoon light reflecting against the windows. Claire approached carrying the same leather notebook she had brought on her first day. It looked slightly more worn now, filled with fresh notes and completed plans. Ethan took a slow breath before speaking. "There is something I should have said a long time ago." Claire stopped beside him. Without saying anything. "When you walked away 3 years ago," he continued, "I believed I had lost someone who depended on me. I understand now that I lost the person who made me better than I deserved to be." Claire looked out across the skyline before answering. "People cannot build their future by living inside their regrets." Ethan nodded. "I know." After another quiet moment, he asked the question that had been waiting between them for weeks. Is there any chance we could begin again? Claire turned toward him with kindness that carried no uncertainty. No, Ethan. The answer was gentle, but complete. I did not come back to rebuild our marriage. I came back because thousands of families depended on this company, and they deserved every chance to succeed. That work is finished. Ethan lowered his eyes for only a moment before looking back with acceptance instead of disappointment. Thank you, he said sincerely. For everything. Claire smiled, the same calm smile that had carried her through every difficult season without bitterness. She extended her hand. Ethan shook it, understanding that some relationships could evolve into respect without ever returning to what they once were. Later that afternoon, Claire stepped outside the headquarters carrying only her notebook and a light coat over her shoulder. Across the street, a black sedan waited to take her to the airport. A global manufacturing group had offered her the role of Chief Transformation Officer, leading organizations across the world through the same thoughtful leadership that had quietly changed so many lives. She paused for one last glance at the building behind her. It no longer represented loss. It represented proof that dignity could outlast disappointment, and that quiet strength often echoed longer than the loudest victory. As the car disappeared into the flow of Manhattan traffic beneath a clear blue sky, Crawford Global continued moving forward, stronger than before, while Claire moved toward a future she had built with her own hands. She never won him back. She won herself,